Hello, I am Chuck Ochiltree, historian with the Archives and History, and I would like to welcome you all to our Archives and History Library lecture this evening. Before we begin with this evening's speaker, I would like to mention a few of the upcoming events. Next Thursday, on July 26th, the block series continues with Charleston native and Huntington resident Sim Frison. On August 16th, Charlie Cooper will be showing excerpts from the 1932 film Charleston, Beautiful on the Canal, and discuss the work that went into the production of this film. On August 30th, the final block series speaker of the season, Dr. Charles Byers, will discuss his experiences in education. For other upcoming events, check our website, please, at wvculture.org/history, or our Facebook page. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome an adopted son of West Virginia, Mr. Kyle Warmack. He will speak about the origins and development of the Naval Ordnance Plant in South Charleston and his efforts to recover the history of this very important plant. These efforts will culminate in the South Charleston Interpretive Center's Special Ordnance Plant exhibit that will open on September 3rd of this year. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Warmack.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this in the right spot. And I'm going to tap this for Buddy. Okay. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I apologize in advance for how much I'm going to be looking at my notes. I had to put a lot of information in what I consider to be a very short amount of time for this plant. So I'm going to be looking at my notes because otherwise I'd be talking for about 6 hours. So I'll let you know when intermission is ready. But before I dive into this mile-a-minute exploration of the Naval Ordnance Plant's rich past, a huge thank you to Archives and History for this opportunity and for their bottomless help through this process. There is, I'm pretty sure, no one at this archive who hasn't dug up something for me, something obscure, who has brought research suggestions to the table, or just plain been helpful. So I've tried their patience a lot, and they've made me a better researcher. And special thank you to Chuck for his never-ending patience with my requests. As Chuck mentioned, this research project is going to culminate in an exhibit at the South Charleston Interpretive Center. It's actually so big we can't fit it in the South Charleston Interpretive Center. So we will have a special exhibit space set up at 6th and F Street from September 3rd to October 27th. The material in this presentation tonight is a fraction of that, of what's going to be in there. And also, due to the size limitations in PowerPoint and stuff like that, the images shown tonight are not the quality you're going to see in the exhibit. So don't think if there's anything pixelated and anything like that, trust me, it looks a lot better in real space. So with that, I don't really have any more time to waste. For those unfamiliar with the Naval Ordnance Plant, or at least unfamiliar with its boundaries, showing you where it is gives me an excuse to show off one of my favorite National Archives discoveries. This is a 1938 map of South Charleston from the Bureau of Ordnance Correspondence that was sent by Mayor Oakes of South Charleston to West Virginia Congressman Joe L. Smith in 1940 to request Navy funds for paving F Street in preparation for the finishing of Oakes Field, which is marked in red. I didn't mark that. That's from Mayor Oakes' office. If you come to the exhibit, you'll get to find out what the Navy's answer was. But the map gives a pretty striking idea of what 210 acres set aside in the middle of South Charleston looks like. The map's north-south line is flipped, so if you're a little disoriented, that's why, because it's reversed. But it's pretty easy to orient yourself with the Kanawha River. The smaller chunk on the opposite side of Route 60 is commonly referred to as the North Unit, and that nomenclature will become increasingly important later on, especially when I hand out quizzes, so try to remember that. The other side is usually referred to as, you guessed it, the South Unit. Because I'm the kind of person who likes to have maps and timelines, these are the periods of greatest activity that we're going to talk about tonight, but we will be spending most of our time on the first half, because that's what we were most in danger of losing in this process. Is we do have people now that are still alive that worked at FMC, a few people who are still living who worked during World War II. But we had to do a heck of a lot of work to figure out why this plant was really here to begin with, why make an armor plant here in Charleston and South Charleston, etc. The greatest takeaway I hope I have for you tonight is the opportunity to see that through a century of change, the NOP, Naval Ordnance Plant, has been a bellwether for what's going on in the country at any given time. That being said, it's been extremely difficult to piece together a comprehensive narrative out of all of this, which is puzzling because if it's so grand and so important, why is it so difficult to find holistic sources on it? Well, let's start with names for one thing. Every single one of these is a name that the NOP has been called at some point, sometimes colloquially, most of the time in print. So most of these titles do have a concrete origin that references a particular point in its history, but you can see how this long, lousy list can make it complicated to find things as we go along. Perhaps the most frustrating one comes from FDR himself, which is a particularly gear-grinding term because FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy while the NOP was being built and had only resigned that post the month before he showed up in Charleston and gave this speech. Luckily, this is the only documented time anybody gives it a name so thick and difficult to memorize. So thank you, Frank. I always like to imagine that that's him laughing at us trying to research this 100 years later. Equally aggravating is this little problem. You have no idea how often we run into this, even in newspaper articles. If it had been an ordnance plant, it would have manufactured city regulations instead of warship parts. Which I know that seems trivial, but we've had articles or archival items slip under the radar for months because of this single rogue letter. If I had to guess, I think the plant has remained relatively unexplored because it's never gone anywhere. It's been here from the moment South Charleston became a city. In some ways, it's like a parent or a grandparent that's been there your whole life, growing together and apart, until one day you realize it's grown old and somehow you don't know that much about it. So, about a year ago, this is what we started with. There are no book-length historical analyses of the NOP's history publicly available, period. The Golden Seal article only counts as 12 pages unless you give it a little 4-page bump because there's an article about South Charleston that overlaps into its World War II history, and the South Charleston history book loses 10 pages for being mostly pictures. So outside of primary sources, this is what you get, and none of these, except for the West Virginia Historical Society article, list their sources, primary or secondary. Each of these articles is a very important and very necessary venue for the public to discover the plant, but they provide no gateways to look deeper, except in our case, one lucky coincidence. One of the sources listed in the West Virginia Historical Society article is a WV dissertation from 2002 by Joe H. Camp, Jr. At the outset of this project, I noticed on the West Virginia Encyclopedia page that there were 3 comments, and one of them was from this Mr. Joe H. Camp in 2016. So I knew he was still alive, and I knew he was still interested in the Ordnance Plant after having written this dissertation 14 years before. So I tracked him down through Facebook. We obtained the dissertation through ProQuest, and as I started to look through it, I was staggered that this is what I was looking for. This was a comprehensive survey of the plant's history. It just hasn't been published anywhere. It was sitting in ProQuest and in the WVU archives. So it's a magnificent piece of writing, and it saved us months of research required to simply establish the basic whys and wherefores of the plant. He's been a huge resource throughout this project, and I'm proud to say that with our support and encouragement, he has been preparing the manuscript for publication. We hope to see it out sometime next year. Mr. Camp's text, however, primarily deals with the technology and government policy, so there was still a huge amount of work to be done pinning down a lot of stuff that wasn't important to what he's trying to talk about. So here we go. This is the way I feel about it, but we're going to speed through far too much history in too short a time. For the origins of the plant, we lean heavily on our friend Joe Camp and a very pioneering text called Gray Steel and Blue Water Navy by Benjamin Franklin Cooling. So we really have to, at the risk of sounding like we're going back to the book of Genesis here, to put it all very broadly and simply, naval warfare changes irreversibly on March 9th, 1862, when the Union ship Monitor clashes with the CSS Virginia near Norfolk during the American Civil War. Prior to this moment, armor on warships hasn't really been a thing. It's been largely theoretical. The British and French do have some ironclads, but they've never actually fought anything. And so when Virginia completely trashes the blockading squadron outside Hampton Roads, before the Monitor comes to save them, it's clear that wooden ships The wooden ships of Napoleon's time are no longer going to be an effective fighting force against this kind of thing. So we flash forward a few decades, and we get here. In just under 50 years, we transition from navies closely resembling that of Horatio Nelson to the HMS Dreadnought of 1906 that so famously sets the old European empires on collision course for World War I. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because what we really care about is steel. So in 1862, two ironclads walk into a bar and they smack each other around a little bit. Ironclads are recognized, imperfect as they are, as the way of the future. The British and the French, who depend on their navies to protect overseas colonies, start overhauling their fleets, whereas American naval shipbuilding stagnates after the Civil War. The nation focuses on peace and reconstruction. To put it nearly literally, the Navy rots. American politicians don't see a need to sink money into a navy they don't expect to fight with. And this status quo is exacerbated by the industrial metal interests of the day, because in the 1870s, most American metallurgical firms are quite content to work with iron. It's cheaper. While across the pond, new steel processes for armor manufacture, namely the Schneider, Harvey, and Krupp methods, become successfully commercialized in Europe. Trust me, this is all going to add up. This is officially a problem by the 1880s for the American Navy. Steel has a better weight-to-strength ratio, which means that European navies are getting better guns that shoot farther and hit harder, and their armor can take a better punch than American ironclads, which is making the U.S. Navy look like featherweights in a heavyweight fight. So what does the Navy do? For about a decade, various officers and secretaries of the Navy feel, rightfully so, that buying steel armor and weapons from foreign suppliers leaves the country one step behind and very vulnerable in the event of war. But they can't convince Congress or domestic manufacturers to do anything about it, which is interesting. Why don't domestic manufacturers jump on this? As the 1880s progress, industrial steel is starting to happen in the U.S., and pretty soon we have Bethlehem Steel and Carnegie. So why don't they put their hats into the ring? Despite the complicated politics going on between Big Steel and the U.S. government at the time, many of these reasons are simpler than you would think. One, ships are big. In order to win a contract to completely revamp the U.S. Navy, you have to be willing to devote a staggering amount of industrial capacity and manpower to the job. So the steel companies see too much effort and not enough profit at this time. Armor plate can weigh over 70 tons, a single plate. So this isn't a boutique operation. This isn't your local blacksmith. It must be one of the big steel companies to produce such a titanic product. Plus, the plates are often reheated and heated and worked with over 50 times during the forging process. In the 1880s, a single piece of armor could take months to manufacture. And in 1920, screwing up a piece of armor plate during the forging process was a loss of about $50,000 for one plate, and you had to start over again. That's just not attractive to big steel. Plus, the furnaces have to operate continuously. It's not like turning the oven off and on again. They take a lot of time and energy to keep burning at thousands of degrees, and letting them cool all the way can damage them. So that's not a good investment for them either. And finally, the most important point, no U.S. firms know how to make military-grade steel at this point. They have to purchase the patent rights from one of the big three processes. I mean, Schneider, Krupp, or Harvey gets a royalty on every ton of armor produced, not to mention importing special equipment that the U.S. steel firms don't own. So summing it up, the playing field is very small. Imagine if the U.S. Army tried to get Tesla Motors to make its next big tank. It's not happening. You have to work with these handful of big businesses. But Bethlehem and Carnegie, they do get it. They know this is a matter of time. They just don't want it to be their cash that's on the line. So in 1887, with a promise from the U.S. Navy of a minimum order for new armor, Bethlehem buys patent rights to the Schneider process and ships an entire armor factory from Europe to Pennsylvania. It's finally time. It's happening. We're here. But things go wrong pretty quickly. The factory takes longer to build than expected. Bethlehem gets behind. The Navy seizes the opportunity to broaden the playing field, and citing breach of contract brings Carnegie in to pick up the slack. And this works well-ish until Carnegie experiences a massive strike in 1892 that bottlenecks the armor supply. And then the following year, the Navy finds out that Carnegie has been faking some of its tests, and it's been giving faulty armor to the U.S. Navy. And then it gets worse. In 1894-95, after the initial orders are done, the government discovers that Bethlehem and Carnegie have been selling the same armor the U.S. Navy is getting to Russia for almost half the price. We're not at war, and there's technically no law against it, so it's not treason per se, but you can imagine the outrage in Congress when they find out. Big Steel claims that it had put itself out on a limb by investing in this whole armor thing in the first place because it's sporadic and it's expensive, and so it argued that it had to sell armor at bargain bin prices to foreign governments in order to stay in business for the U.S. government. Whether you believe that argument, whether that holds much water, the truth is that there's an all-time low in relations between Big Steel and the U.S. government. And in 1897, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt appoints an armor factory board to figure out the true price of armor and determine whether a government-owned factory should be built. This is 1897. This is 20 years before we get a plant here. But nothing comes of it. The Spanish-American War breaks out, and the Navy is willing to pay pretty much anything to the steel companies in order to get the armor they need for the new ships. And the whole thing blows over until after the war, when in 1900, frustrated with another season of fighting with the steel firms over appropriations for armor plate, Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina sums it up quite nicely for us. Mr. President, every time that this armor question comes up, and every time it has come up for the past 5 years, we have to travel over exactly the same ground we are traveling today. And he goes on to make the argument about how we've been talking about this armor plant for years and years. So, but the time isn't right. Congress takes no action, and it won't take any action for another 13 years. And as of 1905, there's still only 2 companies in the United States that can produce armor for the U.S. Navy. In 1905, Midvale Steel becomes a third wheel in the bidding process for armor plate contracts. But very quickly, an unspoken agreement forms between the steel trusts and consecutive secretaries of the Navy that whoever bids the lowest sets the price. And then the work gets divvied up equally between all 3 firms. Everybody gets the same. After a while, it's simple self-interest that all companies just submit the same bid, which is as shady as you think it is. But the secretaries feel that at least such an arrangement gives the country 3 operational armor foundries, and it prevents cutthroat competition, keeps everybody's furnaces running. So they're willing to put up with this, even though it's borderline illegal. So in 1913, when contract bids come up for the new USS Arizona, Midvale, Carnegie, and Bethlehem do what they always do. But they forget one very important thing. This guy is the Secretary of the Navy now. Josephus Daniels, appointed to the post by incoming President Woodrow Wilson in March 1913, destined to become the longest-serving Secretary of the Navy since Lincoln's Naval Secretary Gideon Welles. He's a scrappy, likable North Carolina newspaper man with a keen eye for good press and a very sincere sense of patriotic duty. And he's easily up there with Teddy Roosevelt as the man who puts the 20th century American Navy on the map. Appointed by Daniels almost instantaneously to the assistant secretaryship, we're talking days afterwards, is a young New York State senator named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's already a gifted campaigner, but the next 7 years will be Roosevelt's proving ground, connecting him with important people around the country, introducing him to the hard work of managing real assets, in addition to cementing his conviction that a powerful Navy is essential to national strength. The truth is, Daniels doesn't truly win his first fight with the steel companies. When he receives identical bids for the Arizona, he calls representatives from all 3 into his office and asks them point blank if they have mental telepathy. It's the only way he figures they could have all submitted identical bids without illegal collusion. We won't get into the details, but after tense negotiations, Daniels is outmaneuvered, and he's only able to save a little bit of money on the Arizona's construction. But Daniels does tell reporters, "I consider the fight only just begun." This is stuff that makes it into the newspapers, the way that these guys butt heads. And oh boy does he mean it when he says he's not done. Because if you remember Senator Ben Tillman, who spoke about this in 1900, he's up at the top. He's still kicking around in Congress, and he wants to go for round 7 with these steel trusts. Only now he's the chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee. And he likes what he sees in this new energetic Secretary of the Navy. Plus, Senator Claude Swanson of Virginia is plenty willing to co-sponsor bills with him. So they bring the Armour Plant legislation back to life in 1914. Their chief arguments, not particularly new now in this 20-year-old debate about an armor plant, are rather self-explanatory. This is the kind of stuff that we can accomplish as a nation if we have our own armor plant that is owned by the government. And that's when it gets nasty. The bill in various forms is swatted down more than 12 times in Congress. In the meantime, war breaks out in Europe. President Wilson is staunchly isolationist, but Daniels and Roosevelt are no dummies, and they start prepping for the worst as best they can. Senator Tillman launches an inquiry in 1915 that all but burns the steel companies at the stake for price fixing and illegal bidding practices. And finally, in early 1916, President Wilson reluctantly endorses Daniels' burning desire for an armor plant. So Daniels gets the latitude to refuse all of the steel companies' bids on the next round of naval procurement. And that's when the steelmen commit their first major tactical error. They threaten to raise the price of armor by $200 per ton, which is a one-third price increase. This looks like flat-out extortion to the American people. Big Steel backs down, but it's too late. The damage has been done to their reputation, and Bethlehem Steel president Charles Schwab launches a PR offensive at the 11th hour, advertising in newspapers across the country against the armor plate bill. You can see the cover of their booklet on the upper left. They collect answers from people from newspapers all over the country, and they send a 60-page booklet to members of Congress before they vote on the armor plant bill. Schwab even offers to lower the price at the last minute, but that just makes it look like they've been inflating the price all along. It's not unanimous, but Daniels gets his armor plant. It passes in the Senate on March 16th, 58-23 with 14 abstentions. And in June, the House votes on their version, approving it 263-165. On August 29th, the appropriations bill authorizing the Secretary of the Navy to provide for government manufacture of armor plate is signed into law. As a whole, it's the biggest naval appropriations bill in history to date. Daniels declares, "This act of Congress is by far the most important law that was ever passed in regard to the United States Navy, and its effect on the future history of the United States will be far-reaching and probably beyond anything that anyone can visualize today." So in November, Daniels creates an armor plant board led by the improbably named Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher to wade through over 200 cities begging to get the armor plant. You can see Petersburg, Virginia's application in the middle, which, by the way, you can find on archive.org, so feel free to read it. The board narrows it down to 20 cities. All the big industrial companies want Pittsburgh. It's steel country. But in the final countdown, Pittsburgh is too close to the Great Lakes to meet the board's requirement of being over 200 miles from open water. Plus, the citizens of Charleston get together and raise $300,000 to donate 205 acres for the purpose of the plant. The other 4.7 acres will be condemned through eminent domain. And that kind of seals the deal, because they've got 200 acres of free land. And that's how West Virginia gets the nation's first government-owned armor plant. That was exhausting. Charleston certainly stands to gain much from the transaction, but it's still useful to note who's pushing the sale the most in the press. J. Shirley Ross, in the center, is an almost circus showman-like realtor who had inherited the Zimmerman Reserve, a property adjacent to the east side of the plant, and which he later divided into lots for sale. In September 1919, Ross will literally advertise his real estate by having someone jump out of a hot air balloon. And of course, the Kanawha Land Company, which owned the majority of the land being donated to the government, and therefore the ones to whom a lot of this $300,000 is going. This company was largely responsible for the development of South Charleston starting in 1907 through the enticement of a couple of Belgian glass companies from Indiana, but this is really the feather in their cap. There's just one final hurdle, which is that West Virginia state law doesn't allow the federal government to swoop in and take a chunk of land that big. So a special legislature is convened to write a hilariously specific piece of legislation that says the consent of the West Virginia legislature, and I have to shorten it a little bit, is hereby given to the purchase or condemnation or acceptance as a gift to the government of the United States any tract or parcel for the purpose of erecting lighthouses, beacons, signal stations, post offices, armor plate manufacturing plants, projectile factories, and so on. Incidentally, the city of South Charleston incorporates the next month. This is one of the research roadblocks, actually, because all of the literature leading up to this point states that the plant is in Charleston, not South Charleston. The confusion muddies the waters for the first couple of years. Even in the National Archives, there are places where it is referred to as being in Charleston, other times South Charleston. So you have to check both. We left something important out of this equation. On April 6th, 1917, The day before Admiral Fletcher's Armor Board submits its findings to Secretary Daniels, recommending Charleston as the NOP's location, the United States declares war on Germany. Now, this is coincidental to the Armour Plant. They have been fighting about this thing for 20 years, but it will affect the way the plant is built and in what order it is built. In the meantime, however, Josephus Daniels arrives for the groundbreaking of the plant on August 30th, 1917, 3 months after America enters the war. Daniels, his wife, and the officers of the Armor Plate Board join state and city officials in a big automobile parade, with Daniels in the lead in local businessman Robert E. Lee Ruffner's big white car, as it's described in the Daily Mail. This photograph, which we suspect was taken just as they arrived at the site of the future plant, has been published before in the South Charleston History book, in Judy Romano's South Charleston book by Arcadia Publishing, and a cropped version is reproduced in one volume of Daniels' memoirs. As far as I know, our exhibit will be the first time that the photo's key players have all been identified to the public, since the two South Charleston books only identify MacCorkle. The evening Charleston Daily Mail of that day provides a full passenger list for the car, as it happens. Daniels' memoir confirms the identity of Mrs. Daniels in the back seat, though he does misremember Governor Cornwell as the mayor. Oops. We hope he remembered his wife correctly. And thanks to the Ruffner Family Association, we were put in touch with Robert E. Lee Ruffner's grandson, Mr. Robert Chilton, who provided the excellent photograph at right, which doubly confirmed Ruffner's identity and also established that Mrs. Nancy Ruffner loved a good wide-brimmed hat. Mr. Robert Chilton is in fact descended from several people who were there that day, as former Senator William E. Chilton, who helped bring the Armour Plant to Charleston, also attended and spoke at the ceremonies that day, and he is Mr. Robert Chilton's great-grandfather on the other side. We have the text of Daniels' speech from that day from the newspaper. They reprinted it in its entirety, and it's also printed in a compilation of his wartime speeches. So, 30 years after Bethlehem first manufactures steel armor for the Navy, and 20 years after Theodore Roosevelt investigates making a government plant, we have finally broken ground in South Charleston. Thing is, Secretary Daniels doesn't really break ground on the armor plant. That's where he digs up the first shovelful of earth, but the armor plant is still on the drawing board. They'd only started designing anything after Charleston was selected that May. So what they're really working on isn't the armor plant, it's the projectile plant in the North Unit, which was added by an additional congressional appropriation, which actually is part of the wartime spending. No substantial work is being done south of MacCorkle Avenue when they first break ground. Just as there are two divisions of the Naval Reservation north and south of Route 60, there are two distinct plants on this property. The North Unit is intended for the manufacture of large caliber projectiles for the biggest Navy guns. However, as the war progresses and smaller ships, like destroyer escorts, prove more urgent than battleships thanks to Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, the plant's purpose is expanded to cover the manufacture of forging for guns 6 inches or smaller, torpedo air flasks, and steel ingots for general use. They're operational 9 months later, in May 1918. They start producing things before the building is even finished, and they're considered quite productive. The armor plant, or South Unit, isn't needed right away, so construction doesn't even begin on that until October 1918, only a month before the end of the war, which is something that the citizens of Charleston have been told. This is a peace plant, not a war plant. This is a permanent installation. It will take another 3 years to build, but I'm not going to give you a play-by-play on that. Instead, I'm going to walk you through a few neat features of this complex. First, a basic product path through the plant as it was originally designed, which is marked in the pink dotted line. The materials necessary for steel production comes in via the C&O Railroad at the bottom, and they're offloaded in the stockyard of Building 311, which is at the very bottom, which is still there today, still standing as part of Clearon's lease today. One rail of the original stockyard crane, if you look at the left side of the building, still hugs that side of it. So you would be driving through the stockyard. When you drive on that little road, you're driving underneath where the original stockyard crane was. We don't have time to go through the steps of steel production right now, but the diagram of this building shows the basic steps of how it progressed, and that is actually from the report of the engineer, and that shows kind of how the flow of materials would have worked through it. But that building was designed to make steel. This was self-contained. They, as originally designed, we'll get to those issues later, they could create their own steel and from there turn out finished gun forgings and projectiles. Newly made steel ingots in the building at the bottom are loaded onto a shuttle track and moved into the forge and furnace building next up, which currently houses AEP and UPS, where they're heated up again and pounded on the massive presses again and again until the desired shape is achieved. This H shape of the forge and furnace building is a radical innovation of plant designer Roger Freeman, which is different from all other armor facilities at the time, but I'll have to save how it's different from them for the exhibit or the Q&A if anybody wants to ask me about that later. Otherwise, we got to get through too much stuff. After all of these massive pieces of steel start to look like armor plate, they move on the shuttle track to the machine shop, the third highlighted building up in the line, where Gestamp is now. There they'd be cut, grinded, and finished as needed, and then placed on a train and shipped directly out of the building. A few more fun facts about the awesome design of this place. The industrial water supply up at the top at the Kanawha River is pumped out into the through a pumping station on the bank of the Kanawha River to the settling basin in the center of the map. And there it would sit for 5 days to settle unnecessary sediments, and then it would be pumped out to the rest of the plant as part of the industrial water supply. It's basically just river water, so the basin becomes a popular swimming pool for the kids of Armour and Bungalow Parks, the two housing developments that go with it. The plant's marine garrison serves as lifeguards, and supposedly a small chlorine barge is towed around by boat to keep the water kid-friendly. As construction progresses past the end of the war on November 11th, 1918, the plant saves considerable money on power generation because a power plant in Cabin Creek, which had been used to power the ammunition factory in Nitro, becomes available. So plans for an independent power station for the NOP are scrapped, and a substation is installed instead. The giant steam boiler plant, which you see in the lower right, was actually disassembled from the old Hickory gunpowder plant in Nashville and shipped to the NOP and completely reconstructed here. And it was demolished when FMC moved in the 60s. In the upper right is a fun one that simply needs to be addressed because it's lent credence to a popular myth about what was made at the plant, namely the big battleship guns, the gun treatment building. Designed to produce gun barrels up to 100 feet long, which is larger than anything the Navy has ever used. The biggest we've ever made, roughly 66 feet in length. So there's a 105-foot electric furnace, half buried underground to keep the building height practical, and that's the pit that you see this construction team working on. Rough forged barrels would be brought in at the low of the end of the building following that red arrow, and they would be carried by the electric overhead cranes, which are marked in blue. And it basically looked something like this. They would be brought in, and then the high portion, the crane up in the high portion would snag one end of it and bring it up like this, and then they would slowly lower it down into the furnace. And it would take roughly a full minute at the maximum lowering speed to get a barrel that long down into the furnace. However, that facility is never completed, just the building itself. In 1922, still waiting for the overhead cranes to be installed, the plan is shelved, never to be realized. Though the NOP did turn out some smaller parts for 16-inch battleship primary guns in its early years, there's no record to our knowledge of any 16-inch barrel ever made, as the NOP lacked the facilities to do so. So, who's the guy who brings this lovely vision of industrial might all together? His literature isn't hard to track down, but the man himself is very difficult to find, even though he was kind of here in our backyards the whole time in this panorama from the South Charleston Museum. Roger Morse Freeman was born the only son of John Ripley Freeman, something of a globe-trotting celebrity hydraulic engineer around the turn of the century, because that's what they had back then. A hydraulic Bill Gates, if you will, and that's not an exaggeration, because John Ripley Freeman is one of 6 engineers handpicked by Theodore Roosevelt to judge whether the government's plans for the Panama Canal are up to snuff. Because John Ripley Freeman is very involved with the MIT board, it doesn't seem likely that Roger Freeman had much choice as far as where he was going to go to college, so he is an MIT grad. He graduated in 1913. As a result, many of the engineers working on the Ordnance Plant and its design process were from MIT. We found Roger Freeman in this panorama thanks to an obscure compendium called Hydraulicians in the USA. and 3 MIT yearbooks. So one thing is for sure, Freeman doesn't like cameras. He always seems to be trying to squeeze himself out of the picture, and so that's why his placement makes so much sense. When we finally did dig him up in this panorama, he seems to be trying to shrink himself back among all these other people. Freeman's writing, mostly a 50-page paper he published in the Journal for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in late 1920, is hands down the most complete and helpful source we have about the design and function of the Armour plate plant and the massive gun treatment building. So he did send a copy to Secretary Daniels, and it's in the Library of Congress. But lucky for us, Google Books has digitized the trade journal that it was published in, and that's how we got our hands on a copy of it. These early plans for the plant that you have seen in the building cross-sections come from that text. The panorama you see is Freeman's staff of engineers, and the engineers, draftsmen, and architects, which are in front of the plant's administration building, which served as their office. The photograph is not dated, but Freeman and his team arrived in South Charleston the day after Armistice Day in 1918. We think this may have been taken in October or early November of 1919 because there are only 2 Navy officers in the photo. One of them is Lieutenant Commander John Barclay Rhodes, who was the plant's first commandant, and we believe the other to be Captain George Marvell, who assumed command of the plant on October 8th of that year. Marvell arrives in Charleston October 8th, and Rhodes leaves on November 19th, so we're pretty sure that it's somewhere in there. As a parting note to Freeman, part of why he remains an enigma for us is because he died 5 years after leaving this project. A heart failure due to an appendicitis operation. Lake Freeman in Indiana is named after him. The dam that created it was his final project. Freeman's civilian personnel are mostly housed in temporary wooden bungalows next to the settling basin in the aptly named Bungalow Park. 32 or 33 structures which stick around longer than they were meant to, since a few end up being added in World War II, kind of bringing up the number to 40, 42, 43. Several of the courts are named after engineers, including one closest to the plant, which is labeled Freeman Court on one of the maps. But there are far more records on Armour Park across the street, which comes about as this sort of perfect confluence of wartime emergency measures. Because of South Charleston's small population, most of the 2,500 workers have to be imported from the surrounding countryside or even outlying states in some cases, and South Charleston is not prepared for this housing crisis. It doesn't help that the Kanawha Land Company and Shirley Ross have bought up most of the land next to the plant. So many laborers live in these temporary barracks buildings near the plant entrance on MacCorkle, but a more permanent, if small-scale solution arrives in the form of the U.S. Housing Corporation, which is a government bureau created during World War I specifically to deal with the housing crisis created by war workers. Essentially, to ensure the safety of the general populace, most war plants have to be located far away from large urban areas, and as the necessary manpower to work in those plants floods in, housing crises appear all over the country. Armour Park is the U.S. Housing Corporation's project number 18 out of 83. In its post-war report before the corporation is dissolved, it was only around for World War I, and that was it. The writers claim that though the houses in Armour Park are very well designed and built, they tend to be a little samey because the project came so early in the queue, and they're bummed out that the houses don't have blinds. Either way, they build something that lasts half a century and becomes very near and dear to South Charleston. Photographs of the construction process, which begins in July 1918, are sent back to Washington every 2 weeks, and they are now kept in bound albums in the National Archives, and you can see the smaller of the 2 albums down below. The bigger album is, well, bigger, because it contains panoramas, really big ones between 4 and 6 feet wide, and in order to reproduce them at a scale useful to pick out intimate details, the rough composite you see on top is 30 separate photos stitched back together digitally. The bottom version is close to the restored final the finals that we'll be displaying at the exhibit. So the kind of resolution that we consider useful for this stuff, if you can see the tiny red square, the upper right of the panorama, that's the level of detail that we get through photographing these digitally and then restoring them. Armour Park weathers quite nicely through the years. It gets some upgrades from time to time, or an occasional termite inspection under government contract, indicated by these photos from the National Archives. Bungalow Park sort of muddles along too, though it's going to get bulldozed in the late 1950s, about a decade before Armour Park gets the axe. So by early 1922, You've got the biggest armor plate factory in the United States, a projectile plant that's turning out some of the best 16-inch shells in the country, and you can almost make battleship guns there too. It's estimated that this one plant can supply the armor capacity for the entire peacetime fleet. Armour Park has a school with about 200 kids, and a Marine garrison as a police force. This plant is the quintessence of Wilsonian New Freedom democracy, where government provides checks and balances against big corporate trusts, and it also represents the full industrial might of the modern American Navy for the first time. So what happened? 1922 happened. The Washington Naval Conference. Specifically the five-power treaty that prohibits the construction of new battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers by the world's five biggest naval powers. 3 days after the treaty is signed, even before it's ratified by Congress, the plant halts production, and the workforce is reduced to a minimum. The plant is going to be inactive for 17 years. Despite dozens of attempts by local businessmen, local congressmen, and more to either sell the plant, lease the plant, sell the equipment inside the plant, there are businessmen knocking on congressmen's doors the year that it goes into hibernation, asking if they can buy the equipment inside this plant, but nothing happens. There are letters to the Navy from Senator Howard Sutherland, Senator Neely, a bill introduced in 1937 by Congressman Joe L. Smith of Beckley, and nothing can convince the government to do anything with this plant. A small Navy staff is kept on the site, and 36 Marines to keep the eye on the place, and the houses in Armour and Bungalow are rented out. But that's all that's going on, just some people living there. The first 5 years of inactivity make sense because major warship construction is a treaty violation, and there's plenty of reserve armor and guns from World War I to make new production completely irrelevant. Perhaps we can even excuse the inactivity after 1928 when President Coolidge authorizes new warship construction to catch up to the British, because when they made the original treaty, the British neglected to mention that they were counting their warship tonnage in legend tons instead of metric tons, which put them quite a bit ahead of the United States, and the United States actually had to build more warships to try to maintain a disarmament treaty. Very interesting situation. This happens a couple of times. So Coolidge authorizes new ships, but only about a third of them don't get built. So once again, the NOP is still out of a job. But what about the Great Depression? The first couple of years are really rough because in 1931, the New York Sun calls the NOP a $30 million lump of steel. But this still doesn't shame the government into action. Hoover's administration isn't exactly known as the get things done kind of crowd. But when Roosevelt starts his massive New Deal programs to reduce unemployment, he's a Navy guy. He knows how many people can be employed building ships, which is why such a huge appropriation from the National Industrial Recovery Act goes toward a massive warship construction program. So why doesn't he reboot the plant that he knows is greased up and ready to go? There's still a lot of research to be done on that, but I suspect it's because he knows this plant. He helped to build it. There's correspondence between Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and the Charleston Chamber of Commerce. It's apparent throughout the 1930s through the press conferences he's never forgotten about South Charleston. And whereas the NOP can be dusted off and rebooted very quickly, the entire nation's economy is on the ropes, and private industries need more help, especially if global conflict is coming, as the president suspects it is. And he witnessed firsthand during the last war how difficult it is to transition from a peacetime to a wartime economy. So I suspect it's just his order of operations. The other less evident point is the plant's use as a yardstick, and this is actually a word that Roosevelt uses to refer to the plant. This is an idea that pervades Roosevelt's thinking from the days of Josephus Daniels. The plant doesn't have to make anything. It's a latent threat to the steel companies if they don't stay in line. And if they don't, Roosevelt will reactivate the plant and make his own darn steel and armor. He references this in a couple of press conferences in the 1930s, and it's clear that the steel companies understand this threat. So just as the NOP is a perfect mirror to government industrial policy in the Wilson era, it's also a catch basin for the frustrations and the industrial ennui and Roosevelt New Deal ideology of the Depression. Whatever the cause of FDR's inaction on the plant, he personally signals in 1937 that he's not willing to sell it. So Congressman Joe L. Smith drops his bill, and pretty soon WPA workers are on site clearing brush, paving roads, rehabilitating some of the structures, and pretty soon the NOP gives us a great window into some of these New Deal programs. Because in 1939, the plant becomes the regional headquarters for the National Youth Administration. This fairly makes it a whirlwind activity because Carnegie Illinois Steel has already contracted to lease the South Unit, but we'll get to that in a second. In a stroke of genius, the government realizes it has acres of free land and an inactive Navy reservation, a number of unused buildings, and a limitless supply of machine tools to support the vocational training programs of the NYA, because it's got a full machine shop here that it's not doing anything with. So pretty soon there are roughly 500 NYA youths building barracks on the property, while enrolled in roughly 15 or so different vocational courses, including carpentry, radio, and aviation mechanics, like you can see the lady there on the right. As I mentioned a moment ago, Carnegie Illinois Steel leases out the South Unit of the plant and begins rehabbing the armor plate line in June 1939, a couple of months before Hitler invades Poland. Like all the big steel companies, now that warship construction is full throttle, they've got to put out a lot of armor plate. And despite an expansion up at their headquarters in Homestead, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, they don't have enough space to do what they need to do up there. So they lease half of the NOP from the government on terms that are entirely unique to military contracting at this point in history. Believe it or not, Carnegie Illinois' lease to manufacture armor plate in South Charleston for the cost of the plate, plus a fixed amount of payment agreed upon beforehand, is the first of its kind. This is a foundational concept in the way our military industry works now, and this was its proving ground. In addition, an inspector of ordnance in charge, the official title of the NOP's commandant, is required to certify the quality of the items before they're shipped, which prevents, by and large, the standards cheating from half a century before. This formula establishes a nearly unprecedented amount of cooperation between government and private industry and remains the basic formula to this day, and it is the contracting standard by which most companies were held during World War II. Started here. So that's in the works when Roosevelt visits the plant on September 3rd, 1940. He's on a tour of war industry plants in the region. As you can see, the NYA kids have to pave about a mile of road through the part of the plant for the president's arrival. That's the forge and furnace building next to them and the big empty gun treatment building in the deep background. This photograph and some detailed newspaper accounts give us a decent idea of what the president's route was. Here's our handy 1938 South Charleston map again, which Mayor Oakes felt was accurate enough in 1940, so we're going to use it. We've just composited the plant into it. The president arrives at the C&O station on D Street at 9 a.m. and riding with Senator Neely and Governor Holt in Secret Service Car 104, a 1940 Cadillac Fleetwood convertible. He proceeds past cheering crowds through town to the North Unit. It's empty at the moment, but Roosevelt already knows that it's going to be leased out pretty soon. He circles through Armour Park, then proceeds across MacCorkle to the South Unit machine shop. Based on the NYA photos, implied order in the newspapers, and the most logical route through the plant, we think he next pulls through the NYA barracks area and then through the forge and furnace building, where he observes the 14,000-ton press in action. Roosevelt's convertible is what conveys him through all these massive buildings. His polio is too advanced, and he never gets out of the car. These buildings are so massive, he can just drive right through them and observe everything he needs to see from the back of the car. From there, the motorcade pulls out onto Route 60 and proceeds to cross the river via the Patrick Street Bridge, swinging east onto the brand new Canal Boulevard. They go all the way down to the South Side Bridge and cross back to the carriage house, where Roosevelt re-embarks for Washington, but not before telling the people of Charleston, "And so I have come to the end of this sentimental journey, and the idea that was started 23 years ago is now bearing full fruit." What I wouldn't give to have that audio. We have looked, and we're still looking. A month before Roosevelt's visit, 3 representatives from General Machinery Corporation, a general machine tools manufacturer, inspect the North Unit to ascertain the requirements for turning the old projectile plant into the manufacture of small caliber gun barrels. I'll get it. Not unlike what it had done during World War I. On December 1st, 1940, 5 employees, including Chief Engineer Alfred Wieland, who you see standing on the right and bottom right-hand corner, who is the VP of the newly formed General Machinery Ordnance Corporation, begin working in offices across the river, the Daniel Boone Hotel. There are fits and starts in the first year as they're hiring new people and they're getting started. We have correspondence from the National Archives where Captain Roy Pfaff, who's the Inspector of Ordnance in charge for the Navy, notes the growing pains of a company that has never made gun barrels before, but he chalks it up to inexperience rather than incompetence, and boy is he ever right, but we'll get to that in a second. In the meantime, Carnegie's got a green light to go hog wild in the South Unit. By December 1940, they've submitted plans to the Navy, soon commencing on a $50 million expansion of the primary structures. The machine shop at the top quadruples in size, wiping out the unused gun treatment building. It's now the size of 15.5 football fields. As a matter of fact, on the cover of the 1961 bidding booklet from when the plant was sold, you can still see the original profile of the machine shop nestled into the Carnegie Expansion in the center. The forge and furnace building doubles in size and goes from 25 furnaces to 63. It's now the size of 14.5 football fields. And the open hearth building at the bottom stops making steel. So it never got to fulfill that purpose during World War II. But Carnegie is making plenty of raw steel up in Homestead and doesn't need more of that. What it really needs is more finishing facilities. Because what it is doing is it is producing raw steel up at Homestead and shipping it down to South Charleston to be turned into armor plate. So they build another structure next to the open hearth building, and both of them become slab treatment buildings for finishing armor plate. No more pig iron and scrap for the NOP. But first, that happens. It's been a while in the presentation since we talked about why researching the NOP is complicated. Another thorny problem was figuring out who the NOP reported to. I have to abbreviate a long and very, very interesting story. I know you're sad to miss it, but it ends up with hunting down the bound volume containing Henry Knox, Naval Secretary Henry Knox's General Order Number 163 in Washington, D.C., so we could cross-examine it with the 1920 Naval Regulations. And the answer is, I know you're excited, the NOP reported to the 5th Naval District after December 8th, 1941. Prior to that, they answered directly to the Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. So that is something that we owe still, is going to the National Archives in Philadelphia, where they have all of the 5th Naval District correspondence. When the war opens in full swing, South Charleston becomes one of 12 naval ordnance plants that, at least when it comes to their products, report directly to the Naval Gun Factory in Washington, D.C. Generally speaking, each one of these plants specializes in a handful of items, just like our plant does. For example, NOP Indianapolis focuses on the production of the top-secret Norden bomb sight that's often characterized as a war-winning technological breakthrough for the Allies. Ours was armor, guns, and rockets, with a couple of exceptions. And this is the cover of a Bureau of Ordnance magazine that was found here in the state archives, and that cover picture is from Carnegie, Illinois, right here in the valley. And there is an entire article that names individual workers in the photographs. And interestingly enough, because these photographs were taken by the Navy, they pop up in a couple of issues of Popular Mechanics later that year, but without the identification on the workers or the plant. By 1943, output at Carnegie, Illinois is 6 times what it was in 1940, and greater than all other naval armor manufacturers combined. General Machinery Ordnance Corporation also outstrips all other manufacturers of naval gun barrels combined, to the extent that we are still finding these gun barrels. As part of this project, we have reached out to every surviving World War II museum ship in the country, and those that have responded, some of them are finding guns here made here in South Charleston on board. That is a 5-inch 38 caliber secondary battery gun from the USS Iowa, which is currently anchored in Los Angeles. You can tell it's from them, from the General Machinery Ordnance Corporation. NOPSC was the abbreviation, Naval Ordnance Plant, South Charleston. We've also found guns on board the USS New Jersey and a few other ships. Mach's shop machines smaller caliber anti-aircraft guns from forged bar stock, but the larger dual-purpose guns are sent to them partially completed. Mach carries out the finishing work, so they are doing the rifling, the grooving, the screw threads, and finishing them nice and smooth for employment in the Navy. This is something they are particularly adept at. For example, through several innovations, they reduce the time it takes to rifle the bore of a 5-inch gun from 24 hours down to 3. Incidentally, this photograph was used in the Golden Seal article and mislabeled the item as an artillery shell. It's actually the nose and body of a Tiny Tim rocket. General Machinery Ordnance Corporation made 97% of all Tiny Tim rocket bodies ever produced right here in South Charleston. The bodies, specifically, they did make a number of the noses, but not as many of those. The Tiny Tim rocket, for those that aren't familiar, is an air-to-ground rocket that's fired from under the bottom of of fighters. It was a late war innovation, and they actually ended up firing a lot of them in Korea as well. In meeting these staggering quotas, the workers of Carnegie and Mach propelled the NOP into the top echelon of war manufacturing, becoming early earners of the prestigious Army-Navy E Award for production excellence. Of the tens of thousands of wartime plants, only 5% of companies ever receive an E Award. Once you earn it, the Inspector of Ordnance in charge can nominate you to receive a star every 6 months to show you had maintained these standards. So you had to get it early on, and you had to keep it if you wanted stars. Only 8 plants in the nation ever get to 6 stars. Of the war manufacturing companies in West Virginia, 4 of them get 5 stars on their E flags by the end of the war. Carnegie, Illinois, General Machinery Ordnance Corporation, Union Carbide, and International Nickel Company in Huntington. General Machinery Ordnance Corporation at the plant is the first to receive an E Award in the 5th Naval District. And they had a big ceremony to celebrate that on August 10th, 1942. I'm very happy to say that here in this building, working with the amazing people here at Archives and History, we were able to find previously unidentified original negatives from that ceremony of the E flag. That one on the right is from that ceremony. We have not yet found original negatives for the Carnegie, Illinois celebration, but we do have some of the other award events, including the only known pictures at the plant of Admiral George Pettengill, who was the commandant for most of the war. He was the longest-serving commandant of the plant during its lifetime, and he was brought out of a well-earned retirement. He'd actually gone into retirement before the war, and they brought him out. It was well earned. He had been a cadet in the Spanish-American War. He'd been around the block. But the workers make the difference. And if World War II blasted the myth that women couldn't do this kind of work, South Charleston is right there at the top of the pile. Women comprise a huge amount of GMOC's workforce from the start, increasing to over 50% as men are drafted after D-Day, mid-1944. These levels are maintained until the end of the war, and thanks to the American Rosie movement, and thanks Plain and Simple, who are here with us tonight, we've had the opportunity to interview some of these amazing women who are still with us. Thanks Plain and Simple is also the organization that helped organize the appearance of the Today Show in 2012 that filmed many of these women inside the plant. And that clip is available online and I can let you know where to find it if you want to see it. The labor statistics we currently have don't delineate the employment of African Americans at the plant, but we do have glimpses. Famed civil rights leader Leon Sullivan's biography and obituaries reveal him working at the NOP from 1941 to 43 before moving to Harlem to pursue the ministry. He works the night shift to support his education down at Institute. Ruth Edwards, the Carnegie, Illinois Rosie you saw a moment ago, states that the work shifts were racially integrated, something I feel is supported by our NYA data at the plant from 1940, wherein 60 of the 450 to 500 NYA youths enrolled were African Americans in integrated classes. The machine shop classes are especially highlighted in the reports from the Bureau of Negro Welfare and Statistics, which are here at the archive. There's more searching to be done in this area, but it would surprise me if the gentlemen who had received machine shop training in those classes were not employed at plants here in the valley later on. The war ends as quickly as it comes. According to our Rosie Ruth, people literally just drop their tools and leave. And this is an experience we've seen borne out from Rosies around the country. So it's a bit of deja vu for the people of the Kanawha Valley, despite promises that the NOP is still going to be active after the war. West Virginia Senators Harley Kilgore and Chapman Revercombe, along with 2 more senators representing the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion, visit the plant 2 weeks before VJ Day, expressing opinions that it should be kept in active production after war's end. Local union leaders, Chamber of Commerce, everybody wants it working, but it's not to be. Contracts are canceled, people are laid off. However, even though the plant is hardly operating as it was originally intended after 1946, it's time to dispel the myth that it was doing nothing. As early as July 1944, a small corps of NOP employees was being trained in a new concept, the Ordnance Tool Room, or OTR. To sum up the OTR, the Navy learned its lessons from the decay in manufacturing resources between the wars. So, as the end of the war looms on the horizon in 1944-45, it begins stockpiling equipment in the open hearth building as plants deactivate. Carnegie, Illinois vacates the open hearth building, and this gear is shipped in from around the country to South Charleston, where it is meticulously cataloged and stored by a team of about 85 people. 3 floors, each about 100,000 square feet, are filled up with reserve manufacturing tools, and 2 big freight elevators take it all up and down as needed. By the end of the war, over 10,000 pieces, valued at $60 million, are stored in South Charleston. In the meantime, the military feels it can use the free land for budding Cold War reserve forces, so Navy, Marine, and Army reserve centers are added to the property, the Marines being stationed in the old barracks, which had doubled in size during the war. So the NOP isn't dead, not nearly as dead as before. In fact, for the first time, portions of the building are leased out to private industrial firms for commercial production, but the businesses are short-lived, and by 1953, the military stops trying. So just as its condition reflects mobilization, and in military-industrial trends in 2 world wars and the Depression, it's going to mirror the 50s pretty efficiently too. When the Korean War breaks out, the OTR plays an important role as military manufacturers across the country borrow equipment from South Charleston to quick start their production lines. There's no mass mobilization, though. The rest of the NOP's buildings are silent, while the small OTR team in Building 311 loads and unloads trains. A newspaper article in December 1951 claims that Carnegie, Illinois is going to send people down to manufacture armor plate again, but we found no further proof of that actually happening. The whole situation, like the country's engagement in the Korean War, lacks the all-encompassing response of the previous war. There's no signs of the military going anywhere, though, and contrary to the place falling apart, there is a huge amount of documentation in the National Archives about refurbishment plant-wide in 1952-53, including modernization of Armour Park interiors by the firm of Walter F. Martins, who was the architect responsible for the Governor's Mansion and the Charleston Women's Club. By the 1950s, however, late 1950s, the NOP is largely dormant. The post-war housing boom is over, and the nation is hit with a series of recessions. Despite the massive technological advancements of World War II, or rather because of them, traditional sources of employment are dwindling. Factory lines, coal mines, and even chemical production no longer need as many people to make the same products. And the word automation is on the lips of the country like a curse. Eisenhower's administrative policy, however, tends to look at GDP growth and overall employment trends and ignores the specifics of specific areas faced with disappearing industries and chronic decay in job opportunities, if that sounds familiar. Senator Jennings Randolph addresses the joint houses of Congress in January 1960, summing up popular sentiment perfectly when he says the Eisenhower administration, quote, seems to be doing all it intends to do and also seems to believe what it is doing is quite sufficient, even though the stark realities of unemployment and depressed areas are evident in the economic picture. So after several years with no sign of relief from Eisenhower and conservatives unwilling to invest in programs to cushion the industrial transition taking place at the time, the referendum on Republican policies is clear when Kennedy and a Democratic majority are swept into office later that year. Now, there's not much I can tell West Virginians about JFK, but I can highlight his relationship to the NOP. He mentions it while campaigning for the Democratic primary in Charleston on April 11th, and speaks to it extremely directly when speaking on the Mound in South Charleston on April 30th. Here in South Charleston, you have one of the most demanding and important examples of the need for new industry. Your once dynamic and expanding Naval Ordnance Plant, a plant which once employed more than 11,000 men, has been slowly closing down as the government prepares to abandon it completely. In time of war, this vital plant contributed strategic materials, vital supplies, and important armor plate to the great American victory. Your factory was the pride of the nation. But today, in a time of unprecedented peacetime prosperity, the administration has decided that it has no more use for South Charleston. To be perfectly honest, JFK doesn't instigate the sale of the plant. When he refers to it closing down as the government prepares to abandon it completely, that's because the Eisenhower administration had declared the property surplus that very month. So plans were in motion. However, it's clear from an article later that year that the present administration is in no rush to get rid of it. In other words, the car was moving when JFK got in it. He's just the one who floored the gas pedal. He does this in a couple of ways. First, he has the General Services Administration offer the plant for sale before it's even decommissioned. And they accept the only bid that offers to buy the entire property from Food Machinery Corporation for $4,320,000, which he announces to the nation at his 9th ever press conference on April 12, 1961. Now, let's remember something here. The plant was built for $22 million during World War I. it's upgraded for another $55 million in World War II, and it's now being sold for $4.3 million. Even factoring for significant depreciation, this plant is worth well over $100 million in 1961 dollars, which likely means one thing. Kennedy wants to deliver on the campaign promise at any cost. He will not pass up an eager buyer, period. So the deed is transferred to FMC in May that year. And on June 30th, Congressman John Slack, who campaigned relentlessly in 1959 and 1960 to get the plant sold to reboot private industry here in the Valley, receives the last flag flown over the NOP, which will be the first to fly over the new federal building in Charleston. Thanks to the archive, we have newsreel footage of this event from which these stills are taken, as no press photos have been found to date. But it's not just one and done with Kennedy's involvement in the plant. The fire sale is just the beginning. One of JFK's talking points on the campaign trail has been that West Virginia is 50th in line for defense contracts, and now he intends to make good on changing that. When FMC wins a contract to produce its innovative new M113 armored personnel carrier, it's decreed that a certain portion of them must be made on the East Coast, and thus the old NOP, which had grown slowly irrelevant to modern warfare through the late 1950s, enters the new era. Senators Jennings Randolph and Robert C. Byrd enter the theater with a vengeance, too. Byrd had toured the plant with Congressman Slack back in January, and both Byrd and Randolph sponsored two separate bills to force the NOP's sale to private industry that same month, but the bills are dropped when they are informed that FMC has purchased the plant. But now it's their time to shine. Jennings co-sponsors a new Area Redevelopment Act, a version of which had twice been approved with bipartisan support before Kennedy took office and twice vetoed by Eisenhower, who felt it was not the position of the federal government to finance that kind of thing. But now with Kennedy and a Democratic Congress, it pushes through with ease and is signed into law. $394 million is made available to go to localized efforts to jumpstart getting unemployed workers retrained for new and current types of work. So, less than a year later, we find 200 workers being trained by Kanawha County schools in a building being rented from FMC on the Naval Ordnance Plant site, many of whom are expected to be hired straight into the assembly line. Some later estimates place the number of ARA retrainees hired at FMC at over 700. The ARA chief administrator, William Batt, says afterwards that the White House was influential in getting defense industries to locate in there. We put one of the largest training programs in the country into preparing workers for a plant which FMC Corporation took over, a former naval ordnance depot in Charleston, West Virginia. FMC did all this with former coal miners and former chemical workers trained with ARA money under Title 16 and 17. It was the biggest training program in West Virginia. There's more work to be done in the National Archives to establish the full impact of the ARA on FMC and the old NOP. Much of what we've compiled is owed to Royce Deal, who's also with us here tonight, and who's done an incredible job chasing down these leads and collating them into an understandable narrative. But there are no doubts about the ARA's importance to the NOP. Lady Bird Johnson, who is then not yet First Lady, makes a trip to the Valley in March 1963, and one of her stops is to hand out diplomas to ARA retrainees before touring the FMC plant, making a colorful inspection of the reassembly line, which has been turning out M113s for the last 7 months at that time. So 2 weeks later, Congress passes the Manpower Development and Training Act, which adds even more resources to the workers transitioning out of struggling industries. We would be here for another 2 hours if we got into details about the massive FMC strike, which cripples the plant from March to July in the following year, which was meant to resolve the fact that workers on the M113 assembly line were being paid less than people doing the same jobs in California making M113s. Or the big chlorine plant explosion in 1968 that evacuates 15,000 people from the valley and destroys Building 305, which had been GMOC's machine shop and the largest building in the old North Unit. Armour Park was bulldozed later that year. The city of South Charleston leases the grounds from FMC for $1 and christens it FMC Roadside Park, eventually adding bike trails. It will later become Riverwalk Mall. In 1969, though, the Army group in charge of contract bidding changes the rules, and FMC is forced to bid its two plants, San Jose and South Charleston, against each other to keep the lucrative contract, and San Jose wins, and M113 production goes away from South Charleston. Though FMC sold its ordnance division stake at the plant, the journey for some did not end there. It's our great privilege at the exhibit this fall to display the photographs of Danny Miller, a South Charleston veteran who worked at FMC for 2 years, building M113s before being drafted and sent to Vietnam as part of the 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry. And he served, there were South Charleston M113s in his squadron. The fact is, after Cleveland developer Ray Park begins purchasing parcels of the plant in 1970, the plant stays relevant. Roger Freeman and the U.S. Navy's investment in this massive, well-designed building pays off time and time again. It's the only place big enough to accommodate the American Freedom Train and 30,000 visitors when the mobile Centennial exhibit comes to town in 1976. And it's the only pre-existing plant in the valley big enough to handle a long succession of auto parts makers for the next 40 years, including Gestamp's move into the old Carnegie machine shop in 2012. So when you see a crane unloading scrap into a rail car outside the Gestamp building, it's doing so on a track that fed the Carnegie production line. When you see a tank car leaving Clearon bound for the CSX line, it's following the route of gun barrels and rockets departing General Machinery Ordnance Corporation. This talk was just a glimpse, really. I can't emphasize how small of a sliver this is into everything that we hope to convey with our exhibit. And our exhibit doesn't even cover everything that there is to learn. I know that Neil Richardson is here tonight, and we have a lot of information about Ordnance Park in St. Albans that came from our research of the National Archives, and I didn't even get to touch on any of that. So I hope the experience has shown what a rich and bottomless history 100 years of this plant has to show us. We have newsreel clips from the 1960s, hundreds of photos and maps from the National Archives, over 100 items from Archives and History right here, including an 18-minute color film of the NYA plant at the plant in 1940. So the journey has just begun. Our exhibit opens September 3rd across the street from the plant. You can see a little computer-generated mock-up right here. Thanks to the incredible support from Mayor Mullins and the city of South Charleston, and we hope to see you there. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to come up and if anybody wants to.
No, I'm in overload right now.
I do apologize for the mile a minute. Yes, sir.
I noticed on the screen that American Motors operated that plant for a brief time.
Correct.
And I don't remember what happened. Maybe Volkswagen took over.
Yes, that's correct. I believe it's about 1979. AMC moves into the plant in 1974 in October, and then about 1979 they decide to move out. We don't have all the information yet on why they go under and why Volkswagen moves in. But
Go back to Danny Miller's picture.
we can do that. Oh.
Danny just happened to mention to me 10 years ago about his M113 activities. And then Joe Mays asked me about this thing, and I called Danny's church. They gave me his home number. I spoke to Danny, so I was glad that I knew he'd hook you up. And
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We've got about 40 or so photographs from him from his operations in Vietnam, all with the 3/5 Cav, and we're really excited to show those. He's been a big help to us.
That's great.
Yeah.
The facility across MacCorkle Avenue on the river that's currently Clearon, what was that production?
That was General Machinery Ordnance Corporation. That was their gun barrel production at that time. Not all of those buildings survive, and it's harder to recognize them because it was converted into a chlorine plant by FMC, and that's what Clearon ended up buying. So there's all these pipes and other mechanical apparatuses on it, but the big brick building you see with all the pipes on it is part of the original General Machinery Ordnance Corporation facility. Building 305 was their machine shop, and that's what's closer to MacCorkle, and that's the one that was destroyed as a result of the chlorine plant explosion. Yes.
I got 3 questions. So, in your photos of World War I, there were an awful lot of women there, more than I would have expected. What did they do? Were they mostly secretaries?
As far as we know, the majority of what you saw there was the drafting and architectural crew. We don't have IDs on a lot of those people. A few of the key players, but not a lot of them. And that's something that we hope to be able to continue to uncover as who all of those people are in that photograph.
Okay. Second question. I've always been fascinated by how America came together so fast. It was Herculean. Tell me, or tell us, how the War Department kept this all together. How was the production? It just, all over the country. Of course, we knew we were going to be in war, or thought we were, before the public knew. From 39 on, some of the women were working. But I never can get over this incredible sense of impossibility that this country could come together and unify all these plants. You're getting steel from Pennsylvania and all this. How did this get orchestrated?
Well, how much time you got? Speaking specifically to this plant, certainly a lot of people were brought in from outside the area. There are even stories. We know a gentleman from, we've got people from, even just from outside the county, people from Lincoln County moving in to work at this plant. What I can speak to with regard to this plant is there's simply an immense amount of logistical support that goes into this. What we did not touch upon was the additional housing that was built to support this plant. Ordnance Park down in St. Albans, Kenna Homes in South Charleston. These places get built, so you are enabling this apparatus to continue moving. You're providing a support base so that people can move into these areas and work there.
That the production, the supplies, the transportation, all of this, to me, is, I still can't fathom it.
There's a collection of books that is in the Navy Rare Book Room in Washington, D.C. It's called the U.S. Naval Administrative Histories of World War II. And they're generally between 600 and 800 pages, and there's over 120 volumes.
Now, what was the War Department? In other words, you had people that are never talked about who put together this incredible amount of, if you will, business and industrial fitting together. What was the War Department?
Well, the War Department is when it comes to this plant, the Naval Bureau of Ordnance handles most of that. The War Department is definitely a coordinating entity. A lot of this is simply broken down into subdivisions that become manageable. Manageable, that's the word. You have procurement officers. Things are organized into different districts. The naval procurements work differently from Army procurements, but there is overlap. And we do have text from the Army Chief of Ordnance who is talking about conversations he's had with his counterpart in the Navy. And they work together. A lot of these are overlapping contracts, things like that. So procurement, for example, a lot of this stuff when, for example, the Navy needed a Marine order, an order of weapons or vehicles for the Marines. A lot of times they would tack this on to an Army contract, and the Navy would pay the Army back with its funds in order to make that work. So there's a huge amount of coordination, and there is a huge amount to be figured out. One of the reasons why the U.S. Naval Administrative Histories, this massive block of text that would take a lifetime to read, exist is because very early in the war, that project was started, I believe, in 1942. They realized that the mobilization that they were carrying out just on the Navy end alone was going to require, they did not want to forget how they did it. So there was an entire team at the Navy Department dedicated to writing these volumes as the war was being carried out, so that we had the data to work with that. And it's even, I mean, there's a volume, there's one book that's over 500 pages that is just the footnotes essentially on that. It is an abbreviated and condensed version of that, and that's the one you can kind of find out if in the general populace. If you want to actually read all 120 some odd volumes, you have to go to the Navy Book Room. There's no other copies of them out there.
One question, and I've been asked this a lot and I have no idea. So many of the women will be deceased right away or soon. And even in the amount of work that's been done, which is not what it should have been, we do not have a good sense of how many were employed, who worked where. There seems to be no records. The companies themselves threw the records away, and they were allowed to do that. No, there was no record. If you're a veteran, you obviously have a record. But the women and the other workers, the home front workers, did not have a record.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there's some record in Washington, D.C. that has to do with Social Security or something? Where could we go? And I've asked this question to many people, and nobody,
Yeah.
they don't even understand the question.
And that's where it does get tricky. It's one of the reasons why FMC, for example, is harder to research in some cases than the Navy stuff, because FMC kept its own records and it could do with them as it pleased, whereas the Navy records have to be saved. It's hard to track down the right ones. One of the things that we are still working on is hunting down the personnel records at the plant. We do hope to go to the correspondence files of the 5th Naval District in Philadelphia. What I would say is I would start with, in some cases, start with housing. Some of the records that we do have are the housing records for Armour Park, not complete, but some of these things pop up because because this was on a Navy reservation, it is the inspector of ordnance in charge of the plant that administrates the housing. So whenever someone would leave Armour Park or move into Armour Park, there is a record of that is in the Navy correspondence files.
Is there a record of like who bought war bonds through their corporations?
I don't know if there's one. One of the things all I can tell you is, certainly from this experience, is that I can almost guarantee you there isn't one big place where you can go. In a lot of cases, this stuff is split up, and even everything to do with a single plant. For example, we spent time at National Archives in College Park in D.C. We've done research here. You know, there are maps of the plant that were here that we did not have as good of copies of in DC, for example. Some things get microfilmed. You might not have a physical copy of it somewhere, but it might have been microfilmed and stuck into a collection there. So I will say, because it has to do with this war effort, I think it's likely that something is out there. The chances that you're going to stumble into a mother lode where everything you want is right there, you're probably going to have to gather it in pieces. If there's anything I hope that anybody can look at from this process, that this stuff is all over the place. And that was one of the huge challenges of this project and continues to be. So I don't think you're going to stumble into an El Dorado, but I do think you will get chunks of it. Probably a project of a lifetime. Yes, sir.
Is there comparable work done on the nitro plant?
There is a lot of literature out. I haven't studied the nitro plant in detail, but I do know there's a lot of stuff out there on it. And it was actually one of the reasons that, I think one of the small inspirations for this project was I'm looking around, I'm going, well, this plant was here and huge and every bit as big, if not bigger than nitro, and I can't believe there's all this stuff written about nitro and nothing about this plant. So there is work out there, and some of the gentlemen here at Archives and History would know better what specific texts to point you to, but there's definitely work out there on it.
What happened to the large 16-inch gun barrel building you showed a picture of they didn't use and then had a huge hole in the ground that did just get pushed over later?
Yeah, so that's literally in the middle of the area that was absorbed by the machine shop expansion. So it literally just gets, like an amoeba, it just sucks it right up. So that's roughly the time that disappears. Other buildings, one of the things that's difficult to track about the plant is we have a good record of the main buildings, but it's amazing how much of this. There's a lot of, there's dozens of small outbuildings around this campus, and they just disappear and reappear at whim. It's unbelievable the amount of, well, this gets demolished and that, because every time you look at a map, there's something different, something slightly shifted around. But it is remarkable how many of these things are still around, even some of the smaller buildings, little pump buildings and things like that. And if you ever just decide to take a drive through the plant, every time you see a number on a building, that was the numerical designation from when it was a naval ordnance plant. That has been kept consistent throughout. When you see building 311 on a plant, that was building 311 from the moment they labeled those buildings.
It's a clear-on packaging facility now.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yep.
Was there anything produced here that was top secret at the time?
There was, and I didn't really touch on it that much because it's one of the things we don't have a lot of data on. There is a guided missile project, one of the first that we created here, and there was a special ordnance division that took the 4th floor of building 311 and worked on that later in the war. It was used a couple of times. There was a Japanese ship eventually taken out with one of those. It's one of the first experiments in a radar-guided piece of airborne ordnance that was created here by the U.S. military. It's called the BAT, B-A-T.
The nickel plant in Huntington,
Mm-hmm.
they still won't talk with you. Now, have you tried them?
I have not.
Now, you won't find it very much. And we had a student that we worked with for a whole semester, and he couldn't get any information.
Yeah, the BAT, the bat, well, it was nicknamed the bat because of the radar squeaks that it made as it was tracking its target. But there isn't a huge amount of information on that we've found yet. It is something that I hope to dig up a little more on later on in the National Archives. I'm sure we can get our hands on it now.
What's the future of the plant here?
The future of the plant, I know they are doing some work over right now at the in the fly ash pond area. There is about 80 acres of the plant which are currently being redeveloped for a retail development there in South Charleston, and that's the first major change to that landscape in decades. Really, this is one of the reasons why I feel it's so urgent to tackle this project now, is because in about 3 or 4 years, when you drive down MacCorkle Avenue, you'll look over and you won't know that something existed a particular way for a century before it changed in a drastic way. And so I think it's an important moment for us to be examining this, an important moment for us to be photographing it, because it's going to look so different very soon. That's, as far as I know, is the only major work going on there at this time.
Have you been able to tour that facility inside?
Still working on that. Some of the, because there's various business in there. We have spoken with Ray Park's people, which Ray Park bought it in the 1970s, still owns it, and we have kind of the run of the place as far as outside, but we have to coordinate with the individual businesses. It is my hope by the time this exhibit comes out that we will have gotten inside there and gotten to photograph particular pieces of hardware, because I've seen some photographs that show these overhead cranes, and I suspect some of the overhead cranes to be originals with updated controls. And so I really, really want to get some pictures of that hardware, because some of the stuff I couldn't show you tonight, we've got lots of pictures of these crane operators from 1919, 1920, and so a comparison between what these cranes look like now, what they look like then, getting to take a closer look would be really, really neat.
They've all been painted, you probably wouldn't recognize.
They have, yes. I've seen that, but there's a couple of them, at least, that I've seen in some pictures from 2010-ish that still had some of the ID plate, the original manufacturer's plates visible, and that's how we can do some of this reverse engineering.
There's also, I've been told, I've never been down there, cavernous area down below the production floor. I guess for workers to go from one end to another end, or...
Yeah, the machine. I would have to check my notes, but there was an area, a hollowed out area under part of the machine shop floor. I don't remember exactly what it was for.
Well, this is in the production building, the large building on MacCorkle Avenue.
Any other questions I can answer for people?
Great talk. Great.
Thank you very much.